This video is to introduce the Jembatan Besi and Northwood California case studies, which feature in section 3 of Changing Spaces, Making Places. These case studies are looking at social inequality and how it contrasts between two places. On the screen now we can see the specification provided by OCR, which says that we need to know about two case studies of contrasting places to illustrate the types of evidence of social inequality that can be found there, such as the housing, the environmental quality, the crime rate, and the digital divide. The range of factors that influence people's social inequality, such as income, gender, age, health, personal mobility, ethnicity, and education, and how this social inequality impacts upon people's daily lives in different ways. So we have a series of pictures now which will be contrasting the two locations that we're talking about, Jembatan Besi and Northwood California. So on the left-hand side here, we've got Jembatan Besi, a slum region of the city of Jakarta in Indonesia. Slums are generally found in sort of the fringes of large cities in the developing world, in areas which haven't been wanted by other developers and so often have quite a lot of problems inherent to the location and happen where we've got a lot of urbanization occurring. So what we're looking for is what can we see in the picture that tells us that there's deprivation in this place and that we can use to infer more information about this location. So some of the things I'd like to point out to you, first of all, top right here in the background, we've got a large amount of rubbish. So what this tells me is that we don't have waste management infrastructure in place, and we can actually infer a reasonable amount from that fact. So the fact that they're not collecting rubbish and waste would imply that they're also, as a government, unable to provide a range of other services. So as a government, sort of waste management is relatively high priority. And the reason for that is that as there is waste here, this could increase the risk of disease spread. So the sorts of diseases that might come from coming into contact with waste could be things like cholera, possibly dysentery, if people are drinking water which is contaminated with human waste. Something else which is, I think, very obvious within the image is this collapsing bridge that's sort of damaged and not in a very good state. It looks like we've got indications of rust at the side, and the fact that it's falling down might mean that it has sort of dangerous sharp edges. And on this bridge we can see a group of children. And something I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that the children aren't wearing shoes. So the reason this is important is going back to our first point about the rubbish and then the bridge. Not wearing shoes is going to significantly increase the risk that these children may become injured, and this may lead to illness. So a cut to the foot could lead to an infection, could become septic, and if we don't have good healthcare in the area, which seems likely for these individuals because of the situation they're living in, that could cause long-term problems, could even lead to death. Coming into contact with the sharp edges of the bridge and the rust, this could lead specifically to something like tetanus as an infection. If we then come across and contrast this, which is the whole point of these case studies, with what we can see in Northwood, California, from the left-hand side, we've got a walking route, this bridge, which is dangerous. It could collapse and kill these children as they cross it one day. In contrast, we have this footpath in Northwood, California, perfectly safe, basically no risk of injury, certainly no risk of death in this image. If we then look at the building itself, it's a detached large house, and I think we can assume that only one family lives in this house. So we're talking about a quite low population density in this area. Now, high population density, lots of people living close together, increases the risk of disease spread. If one person's got a respiratory illness and they live in confined accommodation with lots of other people, then that disease is going to spread more easily. In a house like this with just one family in it, much lower risk that they're going to catch any illnesses from neighbours, much lower risk they're even going to catch an illness from one another. Something else we can point out, which is related to social inequality, is personal mobility. So this house has a driveway and a garage. I think it's safe to assume that they probably have a car, and this driveway is linked to a road, which again, whilst we can't see it, I think we can assume is going to be well connected and allow that person to travel safely from this location to other locations. Where are those locations? So they may be traveling to school, they may be traveling to work. All of this increases these people's opportunities, and by increasing people's opportunities, it's going to reduce their social inequality. They're able to go somewhere to earn money, go somewhere to be educated. In terms of the environment, no rubbish, very nicely landscaped. this is going to be positive from a mental health point of view. It's going to be positive from a physical health point of view, that people aren't coming into contact with dangerous substances as they are in Jembatan Besi. Okay, so the whole point of this section is contrasting these two locations, and that's precisely what we're doing. So moving on to the next slide, here in Jakarta, once again, we've got what would be described as an informal settlement. So this is, by the looks of it, housing which has been built using materials that people can find, and it's not been built in a way which would be considered safe or up to a kind of building code that we would expect to see in an advanced country. Now, the reason you would have a building code in an advanced country is to ensure that the houses that people live in are free from dangers, free from risk of collapse, have the correct sanitation, all of these factors which will affect how safe and comfortable houses to live in. So these houses don't meet any of these requirements. We've got what looks like a river which is heavily polluted with rubbish, and I think we can imagine possibly heavily polluted with human waste, which brings us back to a previous point that there may be a high risk of contracting a disease like cholera or typhoid or dysentery, which comes from drinking contaminated water. Again, risk of injury or death, so impact to health from what we can see here, and on a less significant level, the children who live here, by the looks of it, will not have a safe space to, say, work on schoolwork and things like this, which would help them to progress in life going forward. Coming across the image on the right, this is a school. And if we look at some of the facilities that are available here, we've got a swimming pool, we've got a couple of sports pitches, a baseball pitch there, and another sports pitch in the background. We've got several tennis courts, we've got a large car park, which indicates that the people who come to this school have the money to pay for cars. Quite possibly many of the students come in cars as well. We've got a designed building which is clearly safe, lots of safe footpaths. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's certainly been planned, unlike the image on the left-hand side. We can also see large amounts of green space, which again is going to be positive for the environment and highlights that the area is not crowded, and that the people who live there have a nicer life ultimately than the people who live in the image on the left-hand side. So here we have some buildings and possibly homes within Jembatan Besi. Again, we see buildings that are either being built or in the process of falling apart, perhaps. But generally speaking, these don't look very attractive homes. They're very densely populated. It's very hard to identify any routes through these buildings. So there will be routes, there will be footpaths, maybe even roads, but they're quite small, and it will be less easy to be personally mobile within this area. If we compare that to the image on the right hand side, we have a whole neighborhood of detached homes, which all look very pleasant. We've got lots of swimming pools that we can see in some of the homes that are nearby. We've got safe, wide roads, which have pavements along the sides of them. We've got other pavements which come through the area away from the roads. Lots of trees, lots of green space, lots of good environmental quality for the people who live there. And a very pleasant, hopefully safe, you would imagine, environment. In this image, we can see a child walking barefoot along what could be either a drainage pipe or a water supply pipe, perhaps. There are then pieces of wood or metal which bridge the gap to the side where there are houses, and then we have this dirty water underneath those little kind of bridge sections. So first of all, if the child fell into that water, that could cause an injury. It could cause them to become hurt and ill, perhaps. There's lots of rubbish. There's lots of potential risk of injury. It's very densely built up, and just not a very pleasant environment for someone to live in. And if we contrast that with the right hand side, once again we have a nice large house that presumably is lived in by one family. We've got a very safe walkway without any of the dangers that we see on the left hand side in terms of risk of falling into this area here, without any risk of coming into contact with this rubbish. A clean, safe, pleasant environment where there's lots of safe personal mobility and nice quality environmental quality. So What you want to know about from this case study can be found on pages 171 to 174 of the OCR Geography 3rd edition textbook. If you're using the 2nd edition textbook, then the page numbers are just a couple of pages before that point. So the key things to focus on as you're taking notes on this case study are the types of evidence of social inequality. So what is the evidence that these two places are unequal to one another? So how is the housing different between these two places? How is the environmental quality different? How might the crime rates be different? How is the digital divide different? So digital divide is to do with access to things like the internet, mobile phones, all of these things. The range of factors that influence people's social inequality, such as their income, their gender, their age, their health, their personal mobility, their ethnicity, their education. Now, I would suggest that between these two places, income is going to play a very big role. So we're going to see that in Northwood, California, there's a consistently quite high income rate, whereas in Jakarta, it's going to be much lower, and that's going to play one of the big roles in affecting people's social inequality. But there will be other factors as well, such as their level of education, their personal mobility, their health. How does this affect people's daily lives? So how is the quality of life for people going to differ between these two locations? Okay.